Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It's a real honour to be invited to contribute this morning. My paper today considers the pre-war development of aviation in Britain's self-governing dominions and in the Anglo-Indian Army before the First World War. It draws on research that I've done as part of my doctorate and some work I've done since then in a number of archives around the world, including archives here in Australia, as well as New Zealand, Canada, America and the United Kingdom. I've also looked quite extensively at the aviation-themed literature and journalism of the period. My intention this morning is to provide some historical context to proceedings today, and specifically to analyse how colonial authorities perceived aviation before 1914 and the factors that influenced the way in which they engaged with it. The published version of this paper will begin with a discussion of aviation's developments before 1914 in Britain. Today, however, time constraints will provide only a very brief summary of this. Interest in aviation in the British Army extends all the way back to the 1850s and 60s when, like other armies in Europe and America, experiments suggested the potential of balloons as platforms for observations, as Sanu mentioned in his presentation. The British Army acquired a nascent ballooning capability in 1878, and during the following 2 decades, British soldiers gained experience on using them in both manoeuvres and in some small conflicts, relatively small conflicts, most notably the Second Anglo-Boer War. Official experimentation with powered flight began in Britain in 1906, and it progressed very slowly. At the time, there was some debate over whether aeroplanes or dirigible airships were most suited to military use. The suddenly rapid expansion and evolution of aeronautical technology in Europe between 1908 and 1909, the employment of aircraft in wars in Libya, the Balkans and the Mexican Revolution, and the adoption of aircraft by continental armies all coalesced to prompt the War Office to establish an aviation unit equipped with both aeroplanes and balloons. Initially part of the Royal Engineers, this unit became a corps in its own right in 1912 upon the establishment of the Royal Flying Corps. By the beginning of the Great War, several British firms, besides a government-sponsored aircraft factory, were designing and producing aeroplanes. Relative to the size of its army, Britain would go to war in the summer of 1914 with the largest flying service in Europe. These developments in aviation's European epicentre first came to colonial society through aviation-themed literature and through the press. Aircraft had been subject of literature, both fiction and speculative non-fiction, since even before the Wright brothers' historic flight in 1903. Science fiction writers such as Jules Verne and H.G. Wells imagined future conflicts in which aircraft acted as decisive weapons. As aircraft became a practical reality in the early years of the 20th century, authors in the British world also speculated on the ramifications this new technology would have for the Empire. In Herbert Strang's 1913 adventure novel The Air Patrol, for example, an Imperial Flying Corps defeats a Mongolian invasion of India. Similarly, in 2 of Rudyard Kipling's novels, a global authority uses air power to enforce a kind of Pax Britannia on the entire world. And there are also examples of this theme coming from within writers in the colonies themselves. Published in Australia, my favourite is a story titled The Command of the Air, which imagined how in 1912 a Commonwealth Aviation Corps would single-handedly defeat a Japanese invasion force. And there's a similar plotline, of course, in Raymond Longford's film Australia Calls, released in 1913. Characteristically, these fictional speculations foresaw aircraft as a means to project considerable power over the vast spaces that separated the Empire's colonies. They took for granted that the relatively large leaps that aeronautical technology had made in the early years of the 20th century would continue unabated. Among the non-fiction titles that reported and speculated on the implications of the air age, for colonial audiences, probably the most influential was a book called Aerial Warfare by a motoring journalist named R.P. Hearn. He argued that in aircraft, the colonies would be able to, and Britain would be able to police the fringes of the empire more economically than armies or navies could. And this was an assumption that colonial advocates of aviation pursued vigorously while lobbying their governments before the First World War. The editor of the British journal Aeroplane agreed, but he had different reasons. To him, the aeroplane projected Britain's racial superiority, and it would, quote, give the white population in the colonies much the same advantage they had once possessed when they alone owned modern rifles, end quote. Besides publishing reviews and extracts from these texts, the colonial press also reported aeronautical developments in Europe and North America, such as Blériot's Channel Crossing and the seminal air show at Ross in 1909, and later on aircraft employment in the Balkan Wars and the Mexican Revolution and Libya. As with the literature, press coverage of aviation in the colonies before the war seems to have frequently associated this new technology with defence matters. Indeed, it would not be surprising if people in the colonies before the war came to associate aircraft with weaponry first and foremost. But it is, of course, difficult for historians to evaluate the impact that such textual representations had on people's thinking. Nevertheless, it seems reasonable to me to suggest that these representations in the press and literature cultivated a sense of awareness and perhaps even an interest in aerial matters in the Dominions, and it also inspired some popular advocacy for aerial defences. One interesting indicator which Brett Holman has analysed is a spate of UFO sightings in Britain, Australia, Canada, New Zealand and South Africa between the 1890s and 1918. It's perhaps noteworthy that often these sightings were associated with the perception of a foreign threat. In Australia, for example, one witness reported the crew of one aircraft calling out to him in quote-unquote a foreign language, while in another instance, one witness reported the object he saw as looking like quote-unquote a Japanese airship. Perhaps significantly, immediately before these sightings, the Australian press had reported trials with airships by Japan's armed forces. Another indicator of the burgeoning air-mindedness in the colonies is the appearance in 1919 of aviation defence lobby groups, both in Britain and also out in the Empire. The Aerial League of the British Empire formed in London in early 1909 to promote aviation at home and throughout the Empire. Agents General from some of the Dominions served on its executive committee, and it established provincial branches in the Empire, including in Australia and Canada. Other unassociated organisations, such as the Aero Club of New Zealand and the Aerial Experimental Association of Canada, also provided aviation advocates and enthusiasts forums to exchange knowledge and from which to lobby their governments. The Aerial League of Australia probably had more success than its other counterparts in that in 1909 it convinced the government to hold a competition to design and build a flying machine for military purposes. The contest failed dismally. None of the 45 entries, such as this one, failed to meet the government's fairly ambitious technical specifications. And indeed, the League failed to raise the requisite money it required to sponsor the competition in partnership with the government. With very few exceptions, aviation experimentation in all the Dominions would lag well behind that of its European counterpart in the lead up to the war, and the manufacturing of aircraft would be practically non-existent in the colonies. The colonies simply lacked the scientific and industrial infrastructure to make much headway in the highly technical and technological arena of powered flight. Things were not helped by the mass exodus of young colonial men interested in aviation over to Europe, where they could learn to fly and had better chances of finding employment. Perhaps recognising this, the London-based Imperial Air Fleet Committee, an initiative of the Overseas Club, raised funds to supply an aircraft to each of the colonies so that they could establish their own flying schools. The committee provided a single Blériot monoplane to New Zealand in 1913 and gave another one to Australia the following year, and then one to South Africa in 1917. Of greater apparent impact on official thinking, however, appears to have been representations by private companies, who in the lead up to the Great War perceived in the colonies potentially lucrative markets. A demonstration tour by the British and Colonial Aeroplane Company in 1911 appears to have been particularly influential. display flights in India and Australia provided local military authorities with a practical demonstration of what aircraft might achieve on the battlefield. In India, the company's aircraft actually participated in manoeuvres, and it impressed the Indian Army's Chief of General Staff, Major General Douglas Haig, to the extent that in May 1911, a whole year before the Royal Flying Corps was established, he wrote to the War Office asking for advice on how the Indian Army could establish its own flying corps and aviation school. After India, British and colonial travelled to Australia, where its demonstrations were reported by officers of the Australian Military Forces to the Defence Department, and their favourable reports, I think, were probably instrumental in convincing Australia's Defence Minister, George Pearce, to publicly commit to starting an aviation corps here. In South Africa, similar things happened with another company, the African Aviation Syndicate, which convinced the South African government to likewise seek advice from London on how to establish a flying corps. Now, in my view, aviation historians have tended to overemphasise the agency of individuals, particularly pilots and aircrew, at the expense of other factors. But that said, it does appear that the attitudes and actions of influential individuals had the potential to decisively shape the extent to which the colonies engaged with aviation before the war. In all the dominions and in India before the war can be found examples of soldiers who, like their counterparts in the British Army, recognised the need to acquire an air capability. Typically, however, the decision on whether or not to do so rested with politicians, and in particular ministers of defence. Their views on aviation tended to be decisive. George Pearce, who I've already mentioned, the Australian Minister for Defence before and during the war, had a well-documented enthusiasm for both aviation and technology more generally. Whereas the Australian military establishment generally treated aviation ambivalently before the war and at best wanted to wait and follow London's lead, Pearce pressed ahead vigorously. Sometimes his decisions even preceded those of comparative decisions about air power from London. Pearce's counterpart in Canada, on the other hand, the somewhat eccentric Sam Hughes, derided the emerging technology of aviation. By one account, he regarded aeroplanes as, quote, costly toys only as yet in their experimental stage, end quote, while another account has him in 1914 dismissing aircraft as, quote, unquote, the invention of the devil. He doubted they would play any role in such serious business as defending the nation. Hughes's scepticism explains at least in part why, despite the relatively sophisticated and successful experimental work done by some Canadian pioneers, and two separate recommendations by his general staff to start a flying corps, the Canadian government did less than some of its colonial counterparts before the First World War in terms of aviation. Even so, colonial leaders such as Hughes and Pearce worked within political and strategic contexts that ultimately influenced their aviation policies. Foremost is the manner in which the colonial governments engaged with the concept of imperial defence. This strategic plan, developed at a series of imperial conferences in the years before the Great War, saw the self-governing dominions take greater responsibility for the empire's defences. Essentially, what would happen is the dominion governments would agree to raise and maintain local forces, and this would allow them to provide for their own regional protection, while also raising expeditionary forces to support Britain in the event of a major conflict. In return, the Dominions, which in most cases agreed to organising and equipping their forces in uniformity with London, would have access to British expertise and equipment. For Dominion military leaders interested in acquiring an aviation capability before the war, this access to British industrial and technical expertise would prove critical. Indeed, all official discussions about military aviation in the Dominions relied closely on advice from the War Office. Each of the Dominion governments weighed up the costs and benefits of imperial defence and then planned their defence forces according to their own perceived strategic circumstances. Australian and South African authorities, for example, perceiving regional threats in the colonial aspirations of Germany and Japan, pursued the development of local military capabilities more vigorously than their Canadian counterparts, for whom the United States Monroe Doctrine provided a measure of some security. Ultimately, funding determined the extent to which Dominion governments acquired a military flying capability before the war. In the context of imperial defence, all increased their defence estimates substantially before 1914, though the available funds tended to be had to be shared between the substantial projects such as compulsory military training and the acquisition of naval vessels and infrastructure. The governments of India and Australia both invested in the establishment of military flying schools and aviation corps before the First World War, though in both cases aviation received only a tiny proportion of the defence budget, just 0.14% in Australia's case. The New Zealand General Staff expressed a genuine interest in aeronautics and sent officers overseas to train with the Royal Flying Corps, but deferred plans when the expense of aviation became clear to them. The cost likewise represented a deterrent for South African authorities, though they changed their mind in 1912 when confronted with the prospect of German military aircraft in neighbouring Southwest Africa. In 1913, the Union Defence Force began training 10 of its officers at a private flying school in South Africa. The War Office willingly provided advice to the Dominions on these matters, and it also invited colonial armies to send and navies to send their officers to train with the Royal Flying Corps in Britain. As I've mentioned before, London's assistance proved crucial to the training of several colonial airmen before the Great War and to the Australian and Indian government's purchase of equipment and employment of instructors for its schools. It's interesting to note, however, that at no point did British authorities compel the Dominions to make a start in flying, and indeed London tended to emphasise the nascent and rapidly evolving nature of the technology and to advise Dominion authorities to take a circumspect approach. The Great War turned these tentative steps in the Dominions into a headlong rush forward. India, Australia and South Africa all fielded their own flying units during the war, and all of the Dominions contributed manpower to Britain's flying services. Ironically, especially given their lack of interest in aviation before the war, their lack of action on it, Canada's contribution to the air war far outstripped the others. Over 20,000 Canadians served in the British flying services during the war. Altogether, at least 1 in 5 of the British airmen who were killed during the war hailed from the Dominions or colonies. As Canada's surprisingly substantial contribution indicates, the pre-war planning done by colonial governments did not prove a prerequisite for contributing to the Empire's effort in the air. Indeed, Indian, South African and Australian efforts to make their own distinctly national contribution on the basis of their pre-war plans proved in many cases to be impractical. The handful of colonial flying units that saw active service were generally unable to sustain themselves in the field, and they came wholly to rely upon the Royal Flying Corps for the supply of their equipment, including all their aircraft, and in some cases even personnel. Meanwhile, government and private aviation schools in the colonies struggled during the First World War to make any meaningful contribution. This is because British authorities refused to release aircraft and instructors to service them, preferring instead that Dominion authorities send untrained airmen to Britain to learn to fly from scratch. These were issues that writers, aviation lobbyists and many of the policymakers had failed to foresee before the war. Through the Great War, therefore, colonial defence authorities would begin to understand the challenges that small air forces present, and they would perceive in their future needs the crucial role of partnerships with the air forces of larger and more scientifically and industrially capable allies. Thank you.
Well, I didn't even need to go to one, Bill, so we now have 15 minutes for questions. So please, who would like to open? Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks. Peter Hobbins from Sydney University. Michael, thank you so much. I always love your work. Having looked through the Commonwealth Military Journal, which was published out of Duntroon from 1911 to 14, there seemed to be a cadre of young Australian Army officers who were very interested in the idea of air power and the development of aerial technology. I was just wondering how much you feel there's a push from these sort of young Turks in the Army in the years before the war to actually prompt new technologies. I mean, wireless is another example that several of them are really pushing in that moment.
Yeah, you're right. And I think there's, in the years leading up to the First World War, from memory, there's 5 or 6 articles that appear. Some of them are from young officers, not all of them young, but officers in the Australian military forces. Some of them are from permanent forces, some of them are from part-time militia, citizen military forces officers. Also, though, they're publishing or they're republishing articles from overseas journals. So they're republishing things from journals in British defence publications and so on. Look, my reading of it is that it's very much a side issue. I mean, the big focus of the Australian Army before the First World War, the Australian military forces before the First World War, is the introduction of compulsory military service. And my reading of the military board minutes during that period of the journals is that this is an all-encompassing, I mean, this is the largest defence initiative that Australia at that time had undergone. Involved a phenomenal amount of organisation, administration, and this is really the thing that's occupying them. For the Navy, it's the acquisition of a squadron of ships to contribute to this idea of imperial defence. So I see that aviation is very much happening on the periphery, and there are a few enthusiasts, and by and large, I think the thinking of those in charge at the time is, let's wait, let's see, let's follow Britain's lead, which my research suggests was actually very sensible, very prudent thing to do. And indeed, in rushing forward, there was a lot of wastage. The school that was opened at Point Cook, such as it was in 1914, practically closes down. In 1916, they still run a few training courses, but the pilots who learn to fly there are being sent overseas and they have to start from scratch anyway. I mean, it really makes no useful contribution to the war itself. So yeah, there is this small, it's a small group of enthusiasts, of evangelists, if I can put it that way, and they seem to have a fairly limited impact on the rest of the army. But again, back to my point, I think it's really the political impetus here, and it comes down, in those days, defence departments were dominated by the ministers in charge. Their bureaucracies were quite small, and George Pearce's decisions on this seem to be very, very influential. Same with Sam Hughes in Canada.
Thank you.
Wing Commander Trav Allen, I just want to take a little bit of a different tack and draw on your experience both in terms of your academic background as well as your current high school teaching job. So are there similarities between what we saw in the pre-war period in relation to air power with what we're seeing now in relation to cyber? So are we seeing the evolution of cyber-mindedness in the next generation with government looking at how do we prepare ourselves for conflict in the cyber domain? And are there any, if there is parallels, are there any lessons we can learn from how we approach it, such as watch someone else take the lead and then Australia responds, or should we take the lead ourselves? Can you see any parallels and any lessons in that?
Yeah, I think we'd have to start by looking at how different Australia is now to how it is then. During the First World War, the Australian government looks at the prospect of manufacturing aircraft in Australia, and they do that because they can't get any aircraft from Britain. The British government just won't release aircraft to come out to the colonies. There's a study done on a feasibility, what we now call a feasibility study, and they conclude in 1916 that Australia is at least 7 years away in terms of industrial infrastructure from being able to produce some of the components that aircraft of that time required. So there's a fundamental issue that the colonies face, Australia in particular at that time, is that they just don't have the industrial infrastructure. Of course, we have universities, we have engineering and so on, but as I mentioned, and this needs to be looked at more, there seems to me before the war to be this exodus of brain power from Australia because the employment prospects, things are more exciting in Europe. That's where the air show, the aerial derbies are. That's where armies are actually using these things on manoeuvres. I think Australia is quite different today in terms of the resources that we have access to in terms of both industrially, although that's changing as well as Tony mentioned this morning, but particularly in terms of our intellectual capital that we have here. So I think I would be reluctant to draw too many parallels there because I think we're in such a different place now, and I think the cyber, what you're talking about, that cyber capability is reliant on different national resources, not so much on the industrial, maybe more so on the intellectual as well. In terms of, you sort of touched on there about young children and young people growing up in this era, and they're interested in air power. That's one of the questions that I really have, because in researching the airmen of the First World War, I'm interested in how they come to air power, how they come to aviation, and it's really hard to see any kind of patterns. But I'd love to, and it's difficult for us to look at what young people in the early 1900s were thinking, what they were learning about at school. In preparation for this paper, I came across some interesting stuff about aircraft models, kind of the precursor of airfix. Apparently these big business in the colonies, British manufacturers were shipping these toys out. And it just sort of triggered this sort of question in my mind, like how much did kids grow up understanding about aircraft? Were kids reading H.G. Wells? Who was reading that stuff? And that's very difficult for historians to determine. We can see that it's being reviewed in the newspapers. We can see that editors and reviewers and that are reviewing it, but it's very hard to sort of measure the impact and how that shapes people's thinking. How many Australian young men go off to the First World War with aspirations to fly? My suspicion is not many at all. And again, it was a very provincial, very boutique kind of thing. Whereas I think cyber isn't so much for young people these days. Yeah.
Thank you. Has a question for that?
Oh, hi, thanks, Michael. Wing Commander Mike Gann from Australian Defence College. I was really interested in your comment about the influence that the emerging air power had on Douglas Haig. Not that we saw any sort of reflection of that in his actions in the First World War. I was wondering if you saw anything equivalent in Australian generals such as Bridges or Monash or Chauvel, and were they influenced by the development of air power pre-war?
Yeah. So all of the advocates that go on record before the war, or most of the advocates that go on record before the war were junior officers. So those authors of those articles that Peter was asking about, they tend to be captains. They're much earlier career. You don't get the generals talking about, as far as I've seen, talking about air power in the Australian context before the First World War. That said, Charles Rosenthal was on the Aerial League of Australia's committee to begin with. So there were some exceptions of higher-ranking officers. For Haig, I think actually his interest in air power does foreshadow his interest in air power during the First World War, including on the Western Front. I mean, he was a big advocate for air power. His relationship with the commander of the Royal Flying Corps in the field in France, Sir Hugh Trenchard, is a very close relationship. His intervention on many occasions on the Western Front secures more resources for the Royal Flying Corps. I think he becomes the popular image of him, of course, is that he's anti-technology. But I think in practice, when we look at, his support for air power during the First World War, he was indeed an advocate of it, and he recognised its potentials to break the deadlock on the Western Front.
Thank you. We have a question over here.
Hi, Michael. Chris McGuinness. You mentioned how the Dominions were highly dependent upon the Imperial Centre for support and so forth. Our Imperial Centre, the US, for example, is looking at the RAAF and how we move to the 5th generation, because we're going to do it slightly before they will, so they're looking to learn some lessons from us, hopefully. Was London kind of tolerating these Dominion experiments with any view to, hey, let's see what comes out and maybe we'll learn some lessons from it?
Yeah, not at all. No, it's really interesting actually. So most of the thinking about air power in Britain before the First World War tends to happen on the tactical level. So they're thinking about how are aircraft going to be able to help the Army in the field or the Navy out in the North Sea in terms of observation. There's very little strategic thinking until relatively late, and that comes about because of Zeppelins. Essentially, the threat that German Zeppelins represent to Britain's traditional isolation suddenly begins to erode some of Britain's, some of the pillars of Britain's pre-war defence strategy. So they're not thinking in a strategic sense. As I mentioned, there are writers who are thinking in an imperial sense, so it's strategic in that regard, I guess, but they're thinking in an imperial sense. They're imagining these kind of aircraft being able to bridge the gap between the colonies. There's no discussion that I found at the official level about that. In fact, when I looked at the Committee of Imperial Defence minutes and I went through years of meetings to see when this comes up. It doesn't come up, aircraft as an imperial tool doesn't come up until the early 1920s, after the war, in the Committee of Imperial Defence. So it really does seem that the advice, and I've looked at all the correspondence between the Dominion governments and the War Office about aviation, it is more or less quite frank. This is what we're doing, this is where we're up to, this is what we suggest you do. We can put you in touch with aircraft manufacturers. We're happy to have your officers come and observe or train with us. But bear in mind, the technology is moving so quickly, things are changing. By the time, and indeed by the time, you know, an aircraft is shipped out to the colonies, you know, it's been superseded. And this is one of the reasons why the school becomes redundant very quickly. So yeah, to get back to your question, there's no sense at all that London is going to learn anything from the colonies in the official correspondence, at least.
Do we have time for one more question? One more question? Going. Okay. Michael, thank you very much. Christian.